Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode brings us Dr. Tal Zaks, former Chief Medical Officer at Moderna and now a venture partner at OrbiMed.
All right, everyone, we'll get started. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hawkes-Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We are thrilled that you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series this morning. We have Dr. Tal Zaks from OrbiMed, previously of Moderna. So we're going to get to talk about not only all things COVID, but general drug development and what's next, and really what we're going to see in the future and what he's interested in. So we're very much looking forward to this conversation today. A special thank you to our partners at Goodwin for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. And on a housekeeping note, please ask your questions. We know you have them. Please ask them either in the Q&A or the chat boxes. And Derek and I will get to them throughout the course of our conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to Derek to kick off the conversation today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And Tal, it's wonderful to have you here. We have so much that we can cover. We can talk vaccines, we can talk innovation, we can talk finance, we can talk immunology. I'm excited. Before we get into all that, why don't you give everybody a little bit of an idea of how you got to where you are? Let's kind of rewind the clock and tell us how you got into biopharma in the first place.
Happy to. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm honored to be on this stage and part of this beautiful city. My journey, one of the beauties of the current era in which we live is the career flexibility, I think, of people's ability to follow their passion when you're sort of in our domain. So I started out, I started in Israel as an MD PhD. Actually, even before that, I was a medic instructor in the military, and I was a PICU nurse for several years during med school. And so, I credit my love of working with teams and collaboration with the fact that I actually started on the other side of the patient's bed, the nurse's side. And as I grew up, I had the opportunity really to dive in and do a little bit of research in something that was then a backwaters of immunology called cancer immunology. And it piqued my interest as a med student. And so I did my PhD on that, and I had a wonderful opportunity at the end of med school to come to the US and work at the NCI with Steve Rosenberg. And truly, I mean, the man is a giant, and he is the father of modern immunotherapy as we know it. I mean, I think even if you ask Carl June about, CAR T cells, he'll tell you he's standing on Steve's shoulders. I mean, the first CAR T cell was cloned in his lab. And so I had 3 wonderful years at the NCI. And I did a whole bunch of stuff, and I couldn't get anything to work. And it was one of the most frustrating things I think in my career. And I kind of looked around and I worked, and back in 1998, years later, I realized as a postdoc, I'd actually published a paper. I was a co-author on a paper that had mRNA as a cancer vaccine on it. This is 1998. Cancer vaccines, boy, we've been butting our head against that one for a long time.
Yeah.
Long story short, I realized at some point that I was hankering to get back into the clinic and feel that what I'm doing actually has an impact. So I backtracked into clinical training, went to Philly, first to Temple University Hospital, which was a phenomenal training place. And we can come back to that. And then I came out of the University of Pennsylvania as another fellowship as a medical oncologist. And I had the opportunity to train with really terrific people, both at Temple and at the University of Pennsylvania. I ended up, because it was the year where kind of cancer genetics was coming to the fore, Gleevec for CML had just been described. And so I went to Penn initially thinking I'd work with Carl June, and ended up working with somebody called David Tuvison, who's today the scientific director of the Cold Spring Harbor.
Yep.
And working really on cancer genetics. And I was all buzzed. So I was, I've had this long track within training. I did a whole bunch of things, saw patients. And I remember I wrote and won this ASCO Young Investigator Award. And I felt so proud of myself. I'm coming home. There's a lot of commotion. My son, who's 12 at the time, looks up at me and says, "Dad, what's all the excitement?" I tell him, "Look, I just got this ASCO Young Investigator Award. I'm kind of all set. They're going to give me a little bit of funding. I can go be an academic." And the kid looks up at me, and was 12 at the time, and says, "Dad, what do you mean Young Investigator Award? How old are you?" And I'm looking down at the kid, And he had a point, because here I am about 38 years old, and it's kind of time to go do something in life, right? And so, true story, I ended up giving the award back in time for them to give it to somebody else. And I had the opportunity to go to GlaxoSmithKline and be the first in a unit that was translational medicine that was figuring out how to get the right drug to the right patients within the field of oncology, around cancer genetics at the time. And as I moved to industry, it didn't take me long to realize that I've kind of found my place. And the reason is that, if you open up a box and you look at a drug label, right? You ask yourself, okay, where does this drug come from? It turns out it doesn't come from the University of Pennsylvania, and it doesn't come from the National Institutes of Health. It comes from the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. So if you want to make an impact and make better drugs, then that's where you should be applying your skills. And I realized then that that was kind of my passion. If I was doing only the clinic, that wasn't good enough. If I was just in research, that wasn't satisfying. And the other thing that I realized quickly within the pharmaceutical industry is that it's really a collaborative effort. It's a teamwork. Yeah, you may be the physician, that's great for you, but realistically, everybody around the table is as important. Safety matters, toxicology matters, regulatory matters. I mean, all these things really have to come together as a team. And it's a truly collaborative environment. And yeah, at the end of it, maybe you don't get as much scientific publications, but for me, that was never the goal. The goal was always to kind of see the fruit of my labor actually make an impact out there. And so I actually found the transition to the pharmaceutical industry quite smooth in a way. I will say this, though, it is a very different culture, and I've always been attuned to the different cultures in which people operate. And it's actually funny, I learned over the years, I think culture is the embodiment of, the practice of shared values at the end of the day. And as you move, I mean, I came from Israel. I worked at the NIH, which is kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of foreign and a scientific culture. And then I come into the clinical world, and boy, is that a different world. I mean, I remember rounds in the ICU, and since I was a PICU nurse, I kind of knew my way around a vent. And as an intern on the first day, I kind of look at a vent setting of the patients, and I asked the attending, are we over-ventilating this chap a bit? And he kind of looks at me surprised, looks at the settings, say, yeah, we can adjust it here and there. After rounds, the resident pulls me into a room and he reams me. He says, look, I know who you are. You're that intern who asked the first grand rounds. That's not how we do things here, right? Yeah. You run things by me, then I go to him. Okay, anyway, long story short, I kind of toned down over the years a little bit. I think they learned how to accept my questions in the right way. But within pharma, it is truly, I mean, a good pharmaceutical or biotech place is a place that challenges you and allows you to challenge others, because it understands that it's all about this collaborative teamwork. And so I had the opportunity to really spend quite a few years in oncology drug development, which was my passion. And all the way through 2014, when I was leading Sanofi's oncology division. And I was fortunate. I was in really good places, but you always have to look and figure out who your role models are and what is your true north. I had the opportunity when I was at Penn to interview with Craig Thompson, who's today the director of Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I remember it was one of those awe-inspiring meetings, because we spent an hour talking about an area of science that I could barely keep up with him, barely, and probably not for some parts. But the thing for me was I was then up all night reading papers, trying to figure out and write. It turns out I was actually too old to join his lab at that point. But it's those things that stay in your head. And I remember along my career, at some point I was in a smaller company, and I didn't feel like I was doing much. And when it all crystallized to me was an AACR meeting where I bump into the late Jose Baselga, who is also at Memorial Sloan Kettering, who I had tremendous respect for. And I'd known Jose because we'd worked together on some trials when I was at GSK. And here I'm at this smaller company, and I meet Jose, and he just came off from giving a plenary talk. And I kind of, I say, hi, and how are you? And, oh, Tal, good to see you. What are you working on? I came home and I told my wife, I said, I didn't have a good enough answer for Jose. It's time to move.
that was your litmus test for this.
I need a better answer. I was kind of dumbstruck for a moment because I didn't have a good enough answer. Well, that tells me something.
Yeah.
So anyway, I at the end of 2014, I was leading oncology's Sanofi's oncology division, and I was looking at interesting companies kind of to bolster the pipeline as you typically do in pharma. And I saw this small company, didn't have anything at the clinic at the time, called Moderna. And I started talking to them, and the more I talked to them, the more excited I got about the potential. Yeah, it's never worked, and yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons why it wouldn't work. But there were two things or three things that really struck me about that. First, the phenomenal opportunity set that this would uncover if we could get it to work. I mean, when I was back at the NCI one day, about a year into it, I'm sitting in front of Steve, in one of his famous meetings, and Steve has a way of doing things. And so he looks at me, he's got his number 2 pencil and his yellow paper pad. And it's the time for me to give my report. And I was doing this, that, and the other because my curiosity was getting the better of me. And Steve kind of looks at me and says, Tal, if only you could focus more. And I'm thinking to myself, oof, you've pegged me. And so here I am with this wonderful opportunity set. Not only that, the platform was such that you could envision, and for years I used to tell this at employees at orientations on day one when I'd meet the new hires, I'd say, this is a place where you can actually go from an idea on a whiteboard to a first time in man. The clinical started in about a year, which was phenomenally fast back in those days, right? Because it takes years in pharma. And the interesting thing that happened to me personally, as I moved to Moderna, I saw this wonderful opportunity set. It could move, it had breadth, it could move quickly. The team there was phenomenal. I mean, Stefan Bunsell, Stephen Hoag, Nubar, who founded it from Flagship, just some of the smartest. I mean, I was the dummy in the room, okay? No, seriously. And it was just the opportunity to do that. And I was turning 50 that year, and one of the things that happened to you in a certain point in life is you stop chasing a career progression that you kind of growing up thinking, oh, this is the logical next step. And you actually stop and say, well, hold on. In the time I've got left to me, what do I want to get done in life? What is it I want to be part of that? If I don't be part of that, I will forever regret it. And that for me was Moderna in 2015. We had nothing in the clinic yet, but it was just such a fascinating opportunity. I came and told my wife, I said, look, this may work, this may not work. I just need the experience. I got to go do this. And, in 3 or 4 years, if it doesn't work out, then I think I'll be employable. I'll be able to make ends meet for us. Because look, we came here as immigrants with nothing. And, it was always putting kind of the career aspirations and the passion for what we do before anything else.
Yeah. It was in a pretty good position though. I mean, when you started, they had some collaboration set up between kind of Merck, AstraZeneca, and that, and Stefan was amazing as a fundraiser, right? So it was actually all of those pieces were kind of in place, and I imagine one of the things you saw as the way you framed it is the opportunity to take this new thing into the clinic, which had never seen a patient before.
So there were a couple of things. Yes, it was to be, a pioneer and a platform, and one that you could see a way towards making so many different drugs.
Right.
It was just astounding. I mean, the coolest scientific experiment I think I've been part of, putting, COVID aside, is the fact that we actually ended up putting a heavy chain and a light chain encoding mRNA in an LNP, injecting it IV, and getting therapeutic levels of protein made in a human body.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, that was just one of the coolest things.
That is very cool.
It was never trivial. And we'll get to COVID in a minute, but it actually took a lot of vision. And, I use that word because it took me a number of years to understand the value of having vision. And here's, another admission: physicians are not very visionary people, and there's a very simple reason for that. As a medical oncologist, I see somebody who's sick. My vision for their future is their past. They all want to get to the point where we've never been sick, right? it's not an engineer's mindset. And this is one of the things I learned from Stefan. An engineer has a vision and then builds a process how to get to realize that vision. Physicians tend to be a reactive species. We like to solve problems. But along the way, I sort of learned that if you don't have the right vision for what you're doing in this industry, you know, you can only get to incremental differences. And the proof for me was in 2015, when I joined the company. Stefan asked me to give my first ever chief medical officer all-employee presentation. And we were about to go into the clinic with a healthy volunteer trial that was for a vaccine against a pandemic threat of influenza in China that nobody's ever heard about. Now, we're a company of about 300 people. We're a paper unicorn in Boston, right? And even our employees don't really get why we would do that. I mean, rare disease, cancer, vaccines, really? And so in 2015, before our first ever clinical start, I get up on stage, and the way we used to do it then was there wasn't a room big enough in the office space we had for 300 people, but there was a Kindle theater next door. So we'd rent out the theater once every couple of months, you know, on a random Thursday afternoon. Everybody free popcorn. The lights would go down. One of the executives would get on stage to tell the company what we're doing. So it's my turn, my first ever CMO. And I tell Stefan, you know, okay, I'm going to take a little bit of creative license with this. I'm not going to use your usual white, you know, logo decks. I'm going to do it as if it's a movie, because we're in a movie theater. And so June of 2015, employees come in, screen goes dark, everybody gets popcorn, the blank is screen, the theater is dark, and the first slide is a black background, movie title, How Moderna Can Save the World. I kid you not. The next screen is like a PG rated green screen to get everybody in the mood. And the rest of the presentation is basically telling everybody, look, you know, a pandemic could be around the corner. We believe this platform can actually react to it, and there's no other platform that can do this. So we have a responsibility to go develop it. And to the credit of the founding team there and everybody who was involved with it, from the get-go, as we were developing vaccines that have a commercial, tangible, you know, return on investment, if you will, we were always trying to develop the platform to achieve that end of reacting to a pandemic. And historically, pandemics have not been good business models. You actually, I mean, most of the investors didn't understand what we were doing. You know, remember Zika? When Zika came, it was our first opportunity to work with the US government. And they actually funded us to try and take Zika forward. That then petered out. But it just shows you, you know, how much effort goes without any benefit. And it was truly based on the belief that this platform, should a pandemic arise, can actually make a meaningful difference. And over the ensuing years, you know, I was fortunate to oversee the most rapid clinical development, you know, in the history of biotech in terms of phase 1, phase 2 starts from a novel platform. But a good part of that was vaccines that were directed for public benefit. And, you know, you then fast forward into 2020, and people got to know Moderna in the beginning of 2020, and everybody felt like this was, you know, in Archimedes in the bathtub moment. But this was not just a eureka moment. I mean, we got to 2020 on the back of two critical things. One, we had already demonstrated that we can raise neutralizing antibodies against 8 different viruses, and that's out of 8 against which we tried. So this platform was pretty good. And the second crucial element was that we were already collaborating with the NIH. And Tony Fauci and his team got to see the utility of the platform up front. They were always looking to give them credit, you know, to be prepared for a pandemic. And so we go down in September of 2019 for our annual meeting with Tony Fauci, John Mascola, and the rest of the team there. And I present, at the time, was a cytomegalovirus, and this is a super complicated vaccine compared to, I mean, this has 6 different mRNAs, 5 of them have to come together to form one antigen, the 6th other. And it worked. It got beautiful neutralizing antibodies. And so I'm showing the data to Tony Fauci and his team, and Tony kind of at the end of it looks at it, smiles at me, and says, "So, are you telling me I'm seeing the best vaccine platform I've ever seen?" Like, and I kind of look at him and I said, "Yes, Dr. Fauci, but let me tell you why." And we kind of go into the fundamentals. And here's the 2 interesting things that came out of that was that first, Tony Fauci and John Mascola wrote a review article that was published online in one of the Nature journals in November of 2019, where they say the mRNA platform has the potential to actually be a very critical piece in defending against the next flu and by extension, any other pandemic. And so they clearly saw it. And the second interesting thing that came out of it was we agreed that the next step of the collaboration would be to pick a virus that is not a threat, something like Nipah that most of us haven't heard of, and artificially start the clock and see how fast we can move to get to a phase 1.
Right.
And in November, December of 2019, we started to talking what would be that virus when somebody started coughing.
And you were like, oh, I think we have a candidate.
Yeah. And so, you know, the beginning of 2020 actually had us prepared. And, you know, people take this for granted. Well, of course, you know, the technology matured, but boy, it didn't have to be so, right? If it weren't for Stefan and the founders of Moderna, we wouldn't be here. I mean, I love Ugur Sahin and BioNTech. I think they did a phenomenal job, but they were never about infectious disease vaccines. It was our vaccines against infectious disease that first hit kind of the scientific community. And in 2017, when BioNTech saw our influenza data, you know, they kind of got together with Pfizer to start collaborating on, you know, developing mRNAs for flu. And that's how they became prepared over time. So it's almost fascinating to reflect that, you know, without that vision that went back years and the tremendous investment that was required to push it forward, we wouldn't have been in the beginning of 2020 where we ended up.
So Joel, let's step back for just a second, because I want us to definitely dig into the details, right, of Moderna's COVID journey, right, which clearly started. You mentioned very early in our conversation today about the collaborative nature of pharma and biotech and how you need all the different people around the room. And then you talked about engaging with the federal government around Zika. Talk to us a little bit about how at Moderna you even decided that was a collaboration that you wanted to undertake, and ultimately it set a foundation. You had the relationships as, you know, COVID came to capitalize on that. Talk to us a little bit about that process.
So when you look at pandemic threats, the history is such that they're very poor business opportunities up until COVID. But if you look before then, you know, we had H1, we had SARS, we had big scares, and, you know, we had Ebola. And you look at the companies that stood up an investment on their own to go solve those challenges, frankly, they ended up holding the bag. It didn't turn out well for them. And it's not a mistake that in the beginning of 2020, you go around and you ask yourself, which large pharmaceutical company actually stood up companies that had deep expertise in vaccines to take on the challenge? And it's shocking that it's really only Pfizer. I mean, the big vaccine players were Pfizer, Merck, Sanofi, GSK, right? AstraZeneca stepped in. AstraZeneca didn't really have as much vaccine experience as any of those four. Pfizer did, to their credit, very quickly through the collaboration with BioNTech, but we all call it the Pfizer vaccine. No, I'm sorry, it's the BioNTech vaccine.
Yeah.
Okay. And so when you go back to Zika, when you have a pandemic threat looming, but you don't know that there's actually a commercial opportunity there, it's very hard for people who are trusted with shepherding, you know, capital to actually devote capital to that activity. And so we were fortunate at Moderna. I personally was fortunate to work with one of the brightest program leaders I've ever met, called Hamilton Bennett. And Hamilton, God bless her, she's an MPH from Hopkins and one of these millennials who, I say this with all the love, really want to do good in the world, full stop. And so as Hamilton's joining us because she sees the public health opportunity here, and we keep trying to ask her, hey, do you want to work on, you know, a commercially viable product? And she goes, no, that's not what I'm here to do. And so as Zika comes to the fore, Hamilton grabs this thing and we start talking to BARDA. And at the height of the threat, when the NIH was trying to develop their own vaccine, we got some government funding to try and be ready for that. But it was clear that this is unlikely to be a commercial opportunity that we could, as a private company, at that time, really leverage shareholder capital. Mm-hmm. Now, when we get to COVID collaboration, let's talk about the financial aspect, and then we'll talk about the other aspect. Yep. But when you get to COVID, I think what's lost on the public is that in January, there was a question of, is this thing really going to be worth shareholder capital? Right. Because it was people coughing in Wuhan, and then somebody got infected in Washington State, but we were still not really sure. We decided at that point, we had no choice, we had to run with it. And I can come back to that. And we'll figure out the finances later, and we'll figure out how to organize ourselves appropriately later. And this is truly, I mean, 100% Stefan's vision and leadership. And he should get all the credit in the world for that. I mean, the rest of us executives, I can tell you, we knew intellectually that this was the right thing to do. It took us a bit to kind of come to grips with the implications for what it is we were doing. By February, it was pretty clear that, yeah, this thing is gonna, we have to go chase this thing. And by March, it was clear, when everybody was going home, that we got to crack this, and we're going to have to raise capital to do it. Now, the US government then finally stepped in with a grant, except people have to understand the way grants work from the US government. What they give is they will guarantee your expenses. So you go spend the money, then you bill them. Yeah. And the truth is, by the time we ever got back to billing, we had enough money in the bank, and we really didn't need the government money. In fact, we paid it all through the pricing of the vaccine, relative to Pfizer. So there was no money at the end of the day that accrued to Moderna through that collaboration. The more important piece of that for me, and we can come back to that, was actually the public trust and the sense that Moderna is valid. This is not just this, fly on the wall, quote unquote, secretive company we never heard of. No, this is actually bona fide. And so I think having that seal of approval with the US government funding, with the NIH collaboration, that was for me the critical reason to collaborate. It's not that we couldn't do the trial without the NIH. In fact, the proof of the pudding is that Pfizer didn't take money and ran the trial themselves. And I was working with a CRO, PPD at the time, with wonderful colleagues who had 10 times more experience than Pfizer in running these kinds of clinical trials. And so it wasn't a matter of bandwidth, it wasn't a matter of capital. What it was two things. There was some expertise at the NIH, and I give them credit for it in terms of trial design, and more importantly, the assays you need to stand up, Barney Graham, et cetera. And that group within the NIH that were absolutely critical, both for us and the rest of the world, in developing those vaccines. And it was the ability to work with some of the experts within the NIH to design the trial, to have that direct line of sight to the FDA as well, but then have the public confidence that this is a vaccine that the NIH has put its, quote, sort of seal of approval. They believe this is real. Right. Because at that point, we were not a Pfizer household name. And I think the public trust and the public confidence really became a huge part of this journey. And we can come back to that, but I think a lot of the learnings for me personally were actually on that axis.
I would have never, I love the way you articulated that, because it wouldn't have occurred to me that would have been an important piece of the sort of the public facing process, right? But I think that's amazing. And I love the way you've characterized it there.
Well, if you go back, I was in one of these pharma HR retreats, and I met a guy who was all about helping executives find their purpose in life. We became friends. I love the guy, Nick Craig from Harvard Mass. He's the leader of something called the Authentic Leadership Institute, and I still have dinner with him once or twice a year because the guy's just so similar. And we sit down for dinner one day. This is back in 2013. And across dinner, he tells me, Tal, we met a few years ago. We talked about your purpose in life, but come on, buddy. 3 words or less, 1 sentence max. What's your purpose in life? Well, probably a good bottle of red wine helped, but I kind of looked at him and said, you know, at the end of the day, my purpose in life is to translate science into medicine. 3 words.
Yes.
And really, if I look back and I look forward, this is what I'm about. And, you know, and then I meet Moderna. And if you understand what mRNA is actually how life translates code into proteins. So I can be part of a company whose core science is translation. Okay, that's probably meant to be. I come into the COVID year and it dawned on me that if we don't learn how to, you know, translating science to medicine is phenomenal, super rewarding, best fun I've ever had. But if we don't translate our medicine into politics, and by politics, I mean that thing which unites us for shared meaning and purpose in life. It's not a bad word. It's actually extremely powerful, and we need to understand it better. If we can't translate medicine into politics, our medicines aren't going to go anywhere. And so, you know, I go up in CNN and, you know, with Anderson Cooper and Sanjay Gupta, and this is after chloroquine has been approved by the FDA, people talking about convalescent sera. And so, okay, chloroquine, sera, Moderna. Yeah, we can connect those dots. Come on. How do you know this thing's going to be safe? I mean, you guys came out of nowhere. You just got a phase 1 trial, right? And it was all about that. And so we're kind of fast forwarding as that year progresses. So we figured out how to collaborate with the government. I can come back to that because that for me is a phenomenal lesson of the journey. But I sort of realized that part of our job, my job as a chief medical officer, is actually now to translate our medicine into politics. And how do you do that? And it dawned on me that we don't have too many tools. You know, biotech and pharma are still a maligned industry, unfortunately. It still bugs me that we did one of the most impactful things, I think, in modern history, and yet, you know, the public is very divided over what they think of that.
Right.
But I'm kind of struggling to figure out, okay, how do we do a better job at that? And what I realized were 2 things. One, we need to better connect to the diversity of the public, especially the pockets that don't inherently trust us.
Right.
And we need to do that through many, many stakeholders. And so 2 things ensued from that. I remember I was invited to the New York Academy of Sciences kind of lecture series in June before the phase 3 trial starts. And Catherine Jansen from Pfizer and me are kind of on the webinar. Everything was Zoom like this. And people at the end of it, people asked me, okay, Tal, at the end of the day, your phase 3 is about to start. What are you worried about? And my answer was, and you know, this is on record, I said, look, I'm not worried about the safety because I think we have a good sense of the profile. I'm not worried about efficacy. I've seen the antibody levels. They're higher than after a prior infection. I think that's going to be okay. I'm actually worried that our trial recruits people who are representative of this country who will then need to get the vaccine. This is in June of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to have to make sure our trial actually is representative.
Right.
And the second thing I did was I actually formed an ethics panel as the trial was ongoing to help advise us. And this is not something we put on our website. I didn't publicize this, but I went to people like, you know, Art Kaplan here from New York, who's become a friend, phenomenal guy. And I brought in a friend of mine, Ann Beal. Ann is a Black pediatrician here in New York City. She was my colleague at Sanofi. She was Sanofi and the industry's first ever chief patient officer, right? She's today on the board of GlaxoSmithKline. And I brought them and a few other folks to an internal Moderna ethics panel. And I basically wanted their guidance on how do we do a better job here? Truly, give me some advice. And at some point in the conversation, Anne looks at me and says, Tal, you know, I've been in your shoes and I know what you're going through, but there's only one answer I can give you, which is you have to be transparent, and you have to be transparent to the point of discomfort. And I looked at her and I said, okay, I think there's something here. And we sort of coined that phrase as our internal guidepost. And what that led to do is a lot of internal discussion, but at the end, as the trial was recruiting, we were actually the first to post our full phase 3 protocol online, unredacted, as the trial was occurring. We were giving patient metrics week by week. Here's how many patients we're enrolling in. Here's their diversity. Here's what they look like. And the learning for me on posting that trial, which was not, not without a lot of internal discourse, because pharma doesn't do that. There's a lot of valid business reasons why you wouldn't.
Yeah.
But my argument was, look, this is truly a public-private partnership here. And with this level of public scrutiny, we need to be transparent to the point of discomfort. I know it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's valid. And what then ensued, and this was wonderful to see, every other pharma that was developing a vaccine within 72 hours followed suit.
Followed it.
The New York Times here in town wrote one of the more positive, write-ups of pharma, I think, in their history, this is what Moderna and Pfizer did. And it allowed us to change the tenor of the conversation. So when other reporters now started to ask me about the protocol, they didn't ask me, okay, what are you not telling me? They asked me, hey, can you help explain on page 83, paragraph B of the statistical power? How does that work? What does that mean?
Right.
Yeah.
And so we could change the conversation from, trust to actually content and better understanding. And, the genesis of that decision was actually, it was an interview that Eric Topol was interviewing Paul Offit from Penn.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of these webinars, and I'm paraphrasing, but the gist of it was Eric is looking at Paul and asking him, so what do you think of Moderna's protocol? And Paul's response was, well, I think they're on the right track, but I'm not entirely sure. I haven't seen the protocol, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm watching that and I'm thinking to myself, Paul's on the FDA advisory committee. He's one of the most trusted voices in the country. I love the guy. He knows what he's talking about. Why shouldn't he see my protocol?
Right.
Yeah.
Protocol, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, we can fix that. And so we decided finally to post it online. And, I'm not supposed to communicate with FDA people who are on the advisory board at all. But the day before we posted it, I actually sent him an email and said, look, I'm not asking for anything. I'm giving you my protocol, our protocol, because this will be online tomorrow. And I want you to have the heads up. I suspect people will come to you for comments and questions. I want you to have a chance to read it. That's what I would want if I were in your shoes.
Yeah.
And so that transparency, and for me, it's kind of part of the closing of the arc, because when I joined Moderna, if you go back in 2015, 2014, the write-ups were about, oh, it's a secretive company. We don't know what they're doing. They don't publish, they don't really, how can they raise so much money? And I'll tell you a funny story. My first executive committee meeting, I go in, or the second, and one of these, kill pieces had just been written on us by one of the rag online, outlets, the clickbaits, as we call them. Mm-hmm. And they kind of, they basically say these guys are not credible. They're secret. We don't know what they're up to. And I asked the other executive to say, hey, we should publish more. And the guys look at me and say, why? Well, nobody ever asked me that. Isn't it obvious? Yeah. I guess it's not obvious. So I said, well, so that we will be more credible. And they asked me, well, why do you feel you need to be more credible at this time? Okay, so that we can attract talent. And they look at me and say, you're here. All right. And so I say, well, so we have money. And they look at me and say, yeah, if you look at our bank accounts, we're actually good for now. So why do you need to publish? I say, okay, yeah, I get it. Fine. Our IP estate hadn't published. This is, we didn't want to, there was a lot of investor money that went into that deserved a return on the investment. And it's all about the intellectual property. And so I said, fine, I respect that on two conditions. One, every experiment we ever do in man, we will publish. And by the way, by law, you don't have to publish phase ones. We're going to publish phase ones, or I'm not the CMO here. And they go, yep, that makes sense. And then I say, well, if that's the case and we agree with that, can we agree that every preclinical experiment that leads to a clinical experiment in an animal model, we will also publish? Because to do an experiment in man, I have to have scientific validity. And scientific validity comes from peer-reviewed publication. And they go, yep, no problem. When we get there and we have animal models, and in fact, if you look at the journey of the ensuing years, we've published it all. We've published the preclinical models, and in the intervening years, the output of scientific literature from Moderna has just been phenomenal. Top-rated journals, rare disease vaccines, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I remember because I was when Moderna started and the journey kind of started. I was in BD for a company up in Kendall Square. We're actually probably a stone's throw from your offices, and from the outside, when you see large amounts of capital being raised, but you don't know what any of the data is, and it's something with kind of like pie in the sky potential, you're like, well, what did they see, right? What do you need to see to write a check of that magnitude? And like, you talk to other people in corp dev groups. I remember talking to the Merck group, because I think they signed on for infectious diseases, right? And it's like, well, what did you see? And they're like, well, they couldn't tell you, obviously, but they're like, we don't do deals without data. Like, we liked what we saw. So there's always a piece of it that is like, is it just because someone stands up and tells a great story that's probably good for X amount of dollars? It's not good for the $700 million that Stefan would. He's very good, but I don't know if he's $700 million good without data. But there always needs to be a point where you wonder what someone else saw to actually see that value. And now it's in the open, right? Now it's been proven in spades, probably better than anybody thought it would work, which is an amazing thing, and kind of just thankful for the whole industry. So we've had a couple of questions, and I think this one is good because it goes back to your initial decision, but it thinks about it from a little bit, of a more general level. So how do you think people or anyone should look at kind of the next opportunity to be a pioneer in a new platform, right? What are some of the macro things that go into that decision? Is it data? Is it funding? Is it people? Your situation is probably reasonably unique, but everybody else has kind of the same factors to think about.
I think there's a lot of uniqueness about the Moderna story, and I think that's true. But I'll make a couple of points here. The first is going back to the collaboration, the true multidisciplinary collaboration. I attribute Moderna, people don't realize this, but Moderna was not the first mRNA company ever formed. It wasn't the second, it wasn't even the third. If you look at people who got together with some scientific, some funding, and some notion of what they wanted to do. So what made Moderna unique? I think it was the combination of truly a multidisciplinary team that had the shared vision and mission and could leverage the competencies required from engineering, from biology and medicine, and from finance. And all of these legs of the stool are as critical. And what's most critical at the end of the day is your talent. It's the talent that can come together for a shared mission, create a unique culture of can-do attitude. And it's not an easy place. And, Moderna was never an easy place to work in. There was always a very high performance bar. Stefan is probably the hardest working individual I've ever met in my life. I mean, the guy's up at 4 or 5 in the morning.
Imagine that says something too.
Yeah.
Oh, and look, it used to drive me nuts because it's an engineer's mindset, and it taught me a lot. So an engineer's mindset, you think you can do something in 3 weeks, great. Why can't you do it in 2? You can do it in 2, good. Shave off the weekends. You shaved off the weekends. Why is it costing so much, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And the funny thing is, physicians don't think like that. I mean, I treat sick people. If somebody is healthy, the concept of making a healthy person healthier, we leave that to the yoga instructors, the quack doctors, the nutritionists. Serious physicians, we don't do that. But yet, what a miss, right? If you think about it. And here I am, a medical oncologist. What did I do? I made a whole bunch of healthy people, healthier. That's what a vaccine does, right? Yeah. And so the way I've managed to internalize that mindset of an engineer. Now, if you look at, if you then extrapolate that to other places right now that I think a lot of innovation is happening, it's one of the reasons for me personally that I left Moderna when I did, which was I had set out to achieve something. I overachieved that by, who knows how many magnitudes on whatever dimension. But I was, having done that, I was both exhausted and with a little bit of PTSD. And it was time for me to kind of, let the wandering gene phenotype express itself, right? And so for me, the curiosity is to kind of step back and ask myself, well, what else is out there that is ripe? And I think there are a few fascinating dimensions that and it's one of the reasons, by the way, I joined OrbiMed. OrbiMed for me so I went around thinking, okay, I can, sit on my own and figure out how to get engaged with the world. But actually, I think a more productive way to do that is by understanding better the finance and the capital allocation aspect. And so spending some time doing it from the investor thesis, I was seeing a lot of investors through the years at Moderna as the one trying to get money. It's interesting for me now to see the spectrum from the other side of the table. And the unique thing about OrbiMed for me was, as I looked around and spoke to a whole bunch of venture capitalists, they're truly a collaborative place. And not because they say so, but because you see who the others want to do deals with, and they keep pointing the finger to OrbiMed. So I said, okay, why don't I go there? And it's a fascinating place for me because I get to be part of the team that's looking across so many different opportunities across the entire value chain, from early investments to later stage companies. And it's given me a chance to kind of, start to survey the landscape of what science out there is getting to the point of it being translatable into medicines, into impact. And there's a couple of interesting themes that are emerging. I think the first and most important one is that the revolution of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and it's starting to get into our space finally. And people have been talking about this for many years. Right. But I have to tell you, it bugs me to no end, with all due respect to my friends who are, radiologists and pathologists, that so much of our diagnosis and healthcare is a function of individual human beings looking and trying to do image pattern recognition, right? If artificial intelligence and machine learning can do anything, it's that. Yeah. So why can't we crack that? And so actually just a couple of weeks ago, I got introduced to a company out of New York City here called Page, who are trying to do that for the world of pathology. And I'm super, super excited and interested.
That's a cool company.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think looking at the places where machine learning and AI is going to start to make a difference. And by the way, I suspect that the next big step for cancer, coming back to my roots, is actually going to be early detection and diagnosis. This was started, actually, the pioneers were again from New York City, Claudia Henschke, David Yankelevich, who were they're now at Mount Sinai, who started the early lung cancer detection program back 20 years ago. Yeah. The data finally showed they were right all along, and you should do a low dose CAT scan in ex-smokers, above the age of 50. In fact, CMS has agreed to reimburse that, several weeks ago. And there's a revolution coming, I think, in earlier detection, that you'll be able to find very early tumors and direct the surgeon to take them out. That is, and we can talk about diagnostics as well, but I think a lot of the places in which machine learning from a technology standpoint are most applicable are not necessarily, the big hairy problems we still have to solve, but they're starting to get closer. And of course, there's a whole bunch of companies that are applying these novel tools to better design drugs, and whether they're large proteins, small molecules, et cetera. And it's just a fascinating space. But again, I think it's going to take that unique melding of understanding the problem you're trying to solve. Too much of this right now is, here's what technology can do, right, but you really need to connect it with, well, here's the big problem we need to solve, and to understand the path in between, and then bring together the right talent and the right types of competencies. Still, I believe in a private enterprise. That's where I've seen the best way to actually align motives and get stuff done. People ask me, gosh, shouldn't we leave this up to governments, right? And the answer for me is quite simple. Standing today in 2022, there are vaccines that have been developed by governments. There are vaccines across the world. There are vaccines that have been developed by private enterprise. Which one would you rather take?
Yeah. It's interesting too, when you think about the translational piece, there's a timing element, right? You need to be at the point where, the next switch that you flip, or when you play the next data card, it's the thing, if it's right, the binary decision, it's the thing that sets off the translational development. And, we believe this is now ready to go into humans, right? And that's a really non-trivial, aspect of things. Are you actually going, are the experiments you're going to do going to actually tell you something about the biology that you believe, that you now say we can take this to a human, right? So you think about, immunology and mouse models and things like that, where what are the things that you have to know in one species to make you actually think that you understand what it's going to do in the next species?
Yeah, immunology has been an interesting one to follow. I think we're at the cusp of a revolution there. There's a local company, Immune AI, that I've gotten to know that is taking a very unique, individual cell omics approach to understanding the immune system. I'm an old school immunologist. It's antibodies or T cells. If it's T cells or B cells, right? If it's T cells, it's CD4, CD8. Well, of course, biology doesn't think that way.
There's a little more than that now, yeah.
we need to simplify things so that we can have concepts we work with. But when you start to apply these tools that are not limited by our cognitive capacity, I think we should be able to get fascinating insights. And it'll be interesting to see how these companies, and there's a number of them out there that have taken sort of a large machine learning AI approach to understanding biology, whether it's, recursion, in vitro, et cetera. It is an interesting space to watch.
So when you decided to leave Moderna and then hopefully took a vacation before you joined OrbiMed, how did you talk with your OrbiMed colleagues about the things you would focus on and where you would like to focus your time and energy?
It's a good question. Well, first of all, I give Carl Gordon and the team there tremendous credit, because from the first time we sat down, they basically said, look, we do healthcare. And one of the things that's unique about OrbiMed is we don't just do this or that or the other. We're large enough, we're experienced enough, and we've seen a diversity. We're looking at devices, we're looking at, and of course, drugs is the hardcore of the business, but it's not limited to that. And so basically, Carl's remit to me was figuring out what you're passionate about and go chase it. You're smart enough to understand that, what we do is return on investment here. We got pension funds, and we got, academic endowments, and we got limited partners who expect us to put their capital to work in a way that's productive. And it's sort of, it goes back to what I learned from Henry Tremere, I think at Genzyme. Henry's great contribution was basically a cultural concept, if nothing else, to say, you first do what's right for the patient, the business will follow. And that is so powerful and so right. And so basically, I think Carl and the OrbiMed team have challenged me to go figure out what are the places that I believe will make a difference and add value there. And going back to vision, it is kind of the challenge I've set to myself in the next phase of how do I take what I've learned and put it to good use along as many dimensions that are as impactful as I can. While I can do it.
Okay, so I have a tough one for you to close out with, right? So you mentioned before, the future of cancer is kind of early detection, right? And if we do that right, where we talk about kind of eradicating the cancer before it gets to later stage, and the quandary here is much like your pandemic challenge. It's a difficult business proposition, because if you catch it early and wipe it out, you're now using stuff further upstream. How do you square away things like the quote unquote commercial opportunity with something that is very obviously better for patients?
So two answers. First, I don't think investment in therapeutics is over. Okay, it's not to the exclusion of trying to do a better job in curing people who have cancer. I'm still as passionate as I was ever about that need. And in fact, science is continuing to make advances on that dimension. I mean, Velostra is another company here in the city. Wasn't part of the funding, but when I came out of Lou Cantley's lab, and when I heard about the scientific, reason for that, I said, cool, let me, I want to learn more. So I do think there's a lot of important things we're doing there. It's a challenge. And I don't mean to minimize it. It's always been a challenge. How do you get to early detection? I hope that we get wiser in how we look at the healthcare system and what payers are willing to pay for. As I think one of the benefits if you move to a reimbursement mindset, and not for everything and all things, but you start to move to a mindset that is value-based. And you start to develop common tools for how you capture value and who is willing to pay for that value. I think that should allow us a movement into better tools where the value is actually preventing mishaps from happening. And by mishaps, I mean, misdiagnosis.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a trivial problem, but I'm hoping that it will be solvable as healthcare systems get wiser.
I think we have time for one last question, and I'd like to kind of bring us around to like to bring us full circle. You talked earlier about the importance of engaging patients and their trust particularly throughout the clinical trial process. Talk to us about ways that the therapeutics community should be engaging patients, building trust. What are some areas that we can do better?
So I think it's along a couple of dimensions. Trying to bring in the patient advocates, I think, deeper and deeper into the development sphere as we're developing drugs. I think every company that's ever tried to do that has found that helpful. I think on the other end of the spectrum, we have to accept the fact that we are a distrusted industry. And we have to accept the fact that some of it is based on fundamentals that are hard to change, which is the way the incentives work in private industry versus healthcare. I mean, for some reason, and this is interesting, but I think it goes to your question, there's a delegitimacy of people making money in healthcare. Well, why should it be okay to make money selling widgets and delivering, cat food to your doorstep, but it not be okay to make your life longer and cured of disease? It's very interesting to me that we've somehow devolved into this in our society. And it's not a universal truth if you look across cultures. But it goes to the other point, which I think we need to meet patients and constituents in whatever way we can. So, when Moderna today said, and I no longer speak for Moderna, that should be clear, but they set a very clear bar to replicate the US Census in every clinical trial they do in terms of diversity. You get there by engaging local communities. And you have to ask yourself, well, okay, if the people are not going to trust me, who do they trust? And how do I talk to their trusted intermediaries? And what I've found is that those intermediaries end up being either at the national level, reporters and politicians, and at the local level, whatever trusted community leader you have, be they politicians, religious leaders, whatever. And we just have to devote more effort and do a better job of engaging with those people and bringing them along. It's fascinating to me that the entire world today can spell mRNA and kind of has an idea at the appropriate grade level of what it is. That was unthinkable 3 years ago.
I know, exactly. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the contributions that you've certainly already made to our society, particularly over the last few years. But we very much look forward to what you're going to do throughout your tenure at OrbiMed. And we're particularly grateful that you're also engaged in our New York biotech community. So thank you so much for your time today, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so
everybody.
Much. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.